Hello. I would like to talk about Oculus. You may now know them as Meta Reality Labs, but they were Oculus before Facebook acquired them. The reason I bring this up is because I want to talk about Oculus's first production headset. I've always had my thoughts about it, but I came across this tweet which made me incredibly excited and also feel kind of validated as well. The first production Oculus Rift had the codename of CV1. It featured 1080 by 1200 per eye, which is not great by today's standards, but it was OLED. It was older OLED, but it's still pretty good. It also had a pretty lightweight HMD and a pretty comfortable head strap, and it also had a cable that broke out to HDMI and USB. It also used Oculus's constellation tracking. Constellation tracking is basically a bunch of LEDs that are tracked by IR cameras. Constellation tracking is still used today in the Quest 2, Quest 3, and Quest Pro in the controllers. Primarily, if you use the Quest 2, those rings had LEDs in them. The controllers, to my knowledge, still primarily used IMU tracking to do most of the velocity and acceleration data, but it used the LEDs as both tracking and a reference point to reorient itself. But really, the original Oculus Rift was your standard VR headset. It used base station tracking and it was hardwired to the computer. It came with 2 base stations, but you could also use 3 or 4. And I do say base stations, but really they are IR cameras, like I mentioned. They aren't laser tracking. They also all used USB. Now, it is in no way a perfect headset by any means. Like I mentioned, it uses USB for the cameras, which, if you've ever used high bandwidth USB, you probably know the problems associated with it. Especially back when it released around 2016, 2017, motherboard manufacturers were not very good at maintaining to the spec of USB. Also, most motherboard manufacturers would cheap out kind of, and they would throw 4, 6, or 8 ports of USB 3 all on a single chip. So it was really frustrating, but besides the USB issues, especially for the power to the headset, which could get annoying with like extension cables and stuff, it was a pretty good headset. The microphone wasn't amazing, and by today's standards, the resolution could be way better, but my experience of that headset was incredible. The head strap was plastic, but it came in this like triangle pattern that was curved to the shape of your head for the most part, and it was really comfortable, and it was probably almost as thin as the cloth head strap that you get on the Quest 2. And the headset itself is just plastic, screens, lenses, and a little PCB. The official weight of the headset is 470 grams. However, I don't know where they get that number from. I don't know if it includes the cable. It definitely includes the head strap, but I don't know if it includes the cable. What I can say from personal experience is that even if both the head strap and the HMD itself are 470 grams, the head strap accounted for about 20 or 30% of that weight. So the actual headset or HMD itself was somewhere in the range of 350 grams. If you compare this to the big screen Beyond, which they say is 127 grams, it sounds a lot more. And especially when you consider that the Quest 2 and Quest 3 are about 500 grams, you might still be thinking, what the hell are you talking about? But at the end of the day, the weight and the center of gravity of that headset were basically perfect. It was incredibly comfortable to wear. And for example, the Quest 2, these days when I use it, it's so heavy. I need to keep it tight to make sure it doesn't, flop around. And all of this is to say the first production VR headset pretty much was perfect. The other part of the headset that I find amazing is the tracking. So like I mentioned, it uses constellation tracking, and that's just LEDs with cameras. It received a lot of critique back in the day because it wasn't on the same level as the laser tracking with lighthouses, which is entirely fair. Like if you're doing something like dancing or whatever, or mocap, it's really important to have really high fidelity. But one thing that it can do that lighthouses cannot do is they can move. Now, I'm not saying they have like motors in them or something, but very often, especially because they're USB and I might like kick them with my feet under my desk by accident or something, I wouldn't have to recalibrate my tracking at all. I could turn the base stations however I wanted and they would just still track. Of course, you still have some of the same occlusion issues that you would with laser or whatever. But considering that reliability of the base stations moving or whatever and still tracking just fine, it was such a more robust solution. I also can't remember exactly, but the reflections also were less of an issue. Of course, if you had like a perfectly flat mirror or a TV or something that was super glossy, you would have some tracking issues. But anything that was slightly diffuse, like a monitor or whatever, it didn't have any issues whatsoever. The audio that came with it was pretty okay. It was similar in idea to the Valve Index, except they were on ear, so they just rested against your ear. The quality was pretty good, but I prefer to use IEMs. Not only are these higher quality, but I can lay down with them on my side. And the original Rift headset as well, the head strap was pretty thin against your head. It wasn't like how the Elite strap is, or especially not how the Index is. The point of me talking about this is that we lost something incredible. Part of the reason that the Rift failed was because of the cable. I would hope that we all know by now that cables are consumable. They don't last. It might be a month, it might be a year, it could be 5 years, you might get lucky. But those cables are a consumable. You step on them, they get, tugged or whatever, they're going to break, right? The precise problem with the Rift was basically 2 parts. One is that I believe it came out before like DisplayPort 1.4 or HDMI 2.0. So it used an older HDMI spec that couldn't really handle high bandwidth. As such, it needed a chip to compress. It didn't use display stream compression because I don't know if it was out yet. And then secondly, it used a connector that was pretty non-standard on the headset side. I believe it was made by Foxconn, but even though I tried, I found the connector itself, but even though I tried to find it, I could not find anywhere to purchase it. So even if I wanted to try to reverse engineer the cable to, like, for example, make a, this proprietary connector to HDMI and USB, so that way I can like have a short version on the headset and then extend it, right? That just wasn't possible. And it didn't make any sense because the bandwidth was not there. So with those factors combined, having a consumable cable that very shortly went out of production after it was launched, you're not going to be able to revive that headset. And of course, you could like have your rig or whatever to help protect the cable. And I like wireless. Wireless is cool in concept, but nothing really beats a raw connection from a cable, right? Today we have the Big Screen Beyond, which uses Type-C. And yes, it is like a proprietary sort of box, and it uses like a fiber optic cable, but that's a much more reliable and probably reproducible set of hardware than this cable was. So the thing for me was that it only needed a USB 2 connection. The only reason it really needed USB 3 was for the power, but that could be solved with a brick. And yes, the brick is annoying, but that brick or whatever, the box, is probably, again, much more replaceable than a cable that is completely proprietary. So besides the cable and obviously the resolution, it was the perfect headset. It retailed for $600 and they eventually reduced it to $500. It was an incredibly competitive headset. And yeah, it's only a PC headset, but think about it. The Quest 2, and I believe even the Quest 3, is a horrible experience, in my opinion. The process of getting it connected to a computer is generally convoluted because you need like their cable or you need to find a cable that's compatible. The Quest 2 sucked because of the power requirements and the fact that I need a third-party cable in order for it to stay infinitely charged. Quest Link is not great. Even Steam Link over Wi-Fi is lower latency and more reliable than Quest Link over USB. And especially just the idea of doing this, right? Like, you can't do that on a Quest. You can only really work with whatever's in your field of view because of the cameras. The Rift CV1 was my favorite headset because Oculus at the time was actually solving a problem. They weren't just trying to get a bunch of money or show off a feature or whatever, right? The people that worked there saw the vision of what VR could be, and they made something that could do that. The people at this company knew what they needed to do to make the user experience great. They wanted to make it as low friction as possible, right? You just set up your cameras, you plug in your headset, you turn it on, and it generally just worked. Again, besides the USB stuff. But That's solvable now. Because of that, I really don't think anything is going to compare to Oculus back when they launched and their headset. I really wish we could have seen a future where constellation tracking was the primary thing. It could have been competitive with laser tracking. For example, imagine if Slime VR was able to tack on just a few LEDs that are different colors or whatever, and it could use that in tandem with the IMU tracking, right? So maybe sure, it gets occluded, it falls back to its IMU, but just like the controllers, right? Because this was already working, they could just reference the LEDs to find their true location and calibrate against the IMU drift, right? The only other modern headset that is anywhere competitive with that is the Big Screen Beyond, because it's so lightweight. And sure, you maybe can have the Vario Aero or the Pimax Crystal, I guess. But what Oculus offered was this all-in-one box. You literally got this black box that folded open and it presented you the headset and the base stations and the controllers. It was an all-in-one experience for $600 and it just worked pretty much. Again, the USB thing. They, to this day, and I'll say it again, they were the best. They provided this tailored experience that just worked. And if you really think about what the Quest is, right? I'm not saying that the evolution of Oculus into Meta didn't do any work with like the Quest 1 or Quest 2, because like John Carmack was still there and some of the other original team was still there to my knowledge. They still did good work. But if you really think about what they did, there was no real innovation. It was just trimming, right? They were trying to trim this thing to fit a mobile phone in your headset, and they were thinking about the scalability of this product, right? It lost all of its soul, and they just worked on the foundation that they had from Oculus. All of this is to say that I just really don't think anyone is going to come close to what Oculus did, unless there are people out there that want to do it. For example, the DK1 and DK2, all of its stuff is still on GitHub, if I remember correctly. If not, I'll note it here in the video, but how the constellation tracking kind of works, how those headsets worked, that information is still up there. I also know that there's an open source headset, right? I believe it's called Relativity. It's like $200 if you get all the parts and you put it together. And sure, it's only IMU tracking, but what's a couple cameras and some LEDs and some software, right? Just time, really, and debugging. I even know this other person, you might have seen them on Twitter, but they kind of reversed engineered how the Oculus works and figured out how to get it working in Steam VR without the Oculus runtime, which is insane. And then if I were to hypothesize about this, right, you know, we had the USB camera issue. That's not fun, but we have power over Ethernet. Security cameras exist, so why can't we do that with some other camera, right? Have a little switch that has USB connection to the computer. Really, each of those cameras doesn't need more than like 100 megabits per second or something, right? Because you don't really need more than like 720p 30. Maybe you could do 720p 60 just for higher, you know, resolution tracking. I feel like there's a huge opportunity here for someone to swoop in and provide a mid to kind of high tier product, you know, like $600 to $800 PC VR headset, all in one solution. And especially if we were to take inspiration from the constellation tracking to provide an alternative to, you know, HTC and Valve's laser tracking, what could we do with that? You know, just having LEDs or whatever, right? Really what I'm trying to get at here is I wish we could have seen the path where Oculus maybe kept going, right? And kept with their open source nature at the beginning, right? And we saw this path of constellation tracking being competitive, like I mentioned. You know, instead of having to fiddle with virtual desktop, AirLink, QuestLink, or whatever, or in this case, me trying to use a Type-C to Ethernet so I can use Steam Link hardwired. So, you know, instead of having to do all these workarounds, why can't we just have an affordable solution that's a little bit more approachable? Anyway, I hope you can understand my frustration. I feel like the current landscape, especially with Meta, it's going to be hard. Sure, like Gorilla Tag or whatever has millions of users or 1 million users or something, then that's all great and stuff, but what VR chat especially has shown me is that there is so much room to grow. The variety of content on VR chat and what people are doing and the experiences they're providing. There are hundreds of thousands of people that own Quest headsets that are just missing out on that. And like, yeah, I know that you have to have like a PC and stuff, but a lot of kids have PCs, you know, teenagers have PCs and laptops can work, and PCs aren't super expensive these days. Like, you know, $1,000 can buy you a really good and capable VR computer. So what is a $600 to $800 PC VR headset that will allow you to elevate your experience magnitudes more than you would on a Quest, right? I just think unless enough people continue working in the open source space and just the general VR community to push VR forward, nothing's going to really happen, right? It's just going to be microtransactions and scaling and profit. And what I'm really getting at is there's a hole in the market right now, especially for PC VR. There's a hole there. And you, maybe not you specifically, but someone could fill it, right? I just think there's a huge opportunity here for something that is just better overall, can improve the user experience, isn't as locked down as the Quest. I just don't think until something like that happens, we aren't going to see major progress. If a company like Meta can lock down their headset so much and even buy a game studio that has a very successful VR game that provided the leading experience for competitive VR games that had 10,000 monthly active users or whatever, and they just killed it, how can we trust them to actually push us forward, right? I guess what I'm saying is that there's a hole to fill, and I highly recommend someone do that. Anyway, I'm sorry for ranting. This is just something I'm really passionate about, and I was really excited to see someone else share that passion. If you like this video, please consider giving it a like. And if you want to see more content like this, feel free to subscribe. I do have a video planned where I'm going to go over the VR theater scene, I guess, because I think it's really cool. So that'll be exciting. Thank you for watching.